The restroom was lit by harsh fluorescent lights, every surface echoing with a cold sterility that made the scene even more unbearable. Sergeant Emily Carter stood rigid at attention, her hair dripping and her collar soaked, the humiliation still fresh from Colonel Victor Kane, forcing her down toward the sink moments before. Around her, recruits crowded the doorway, frozen in place, the silence pressing down like a physical weight. No one dared move or speak, and yet every eye was locked on her. Kane's breathing was loud, uneven, his authority bruised by her refusal to show fear. He leaned closer, towering over her as if sheer force of presence could crush her spirit. The air was thick with the imbalance of rank and power, the kind of moment where most would crumble, but Carter did not. With one fluid motion born from countless hours of Army combatives training, she shifted her weight, broke his grip, and pivoted with precision. Her forearm pressed across his chest, driving him back against the wall, while her other hand locked a pressure point that immobilized his arm without leaving lasting harm. Gasps rippled through the room. The recruits, who only seconds earlier had witnessed their sergeant being humiliated, now stared in shock at the sight of her holding the colonel pinned. The impossible had flipped in an instant. Authority reversed. Fear shattered. Private Daniel Ortiz, standing near the back, slowly raised his phone, angling it through the shoulders of taller soldiers. His hands trembled, but he knew what he was capturing mattered. The lens fixed on Carter, soaked but unbroken, her eyes steady and voice level. She spoke clearly, each word cutting through the silence like a blade. I disobeyed orders to save civilians. If that makes me unfit, so be it. The fog rolled across Fort Ashford before dawn, clinging to the ground and muting every sound. The parade ground was a sheet of gray, the cold air sharp against the skin, and the soldiers in formation stood like statues in the mist. Sergeant Emily Carter stood among them, her frame steady, her eyes fixed forward. She carried herself with the discipline of a veteran who had seen enough of war to understand silence more than words. 4 tours in Iraq and Afghanistan had left their mark, not in brokenness, but in the way she seemed carved from stone. Calm, unshaken, waiting for the next test. The quiet rhythm of boots broke through the haze. Colonel Victor Kane moved down the line with a deliberate pace, each step striking the pavement, like the tick of a metronome. The effect was suffocating. Recruits stiffened at his approach, breaths held, shoulders tightening, as if even the smallest tremor would draw his attention. Kane thrived on it. His reputation was well known, the kind of officer who believed humiliation was a tool sharper than any weapon. He stopped before a private whose hands betrayed a faint shake. His mouth twisted into a smile that was closer to a sneer as he mocked the young soldier for failing to hold a stance. The private stammered, and Kane was gone again, his boots carrying him down the line until his gaze landed on Carter. He circled her slowly, eyes narrowing at the sight of combat ribbons and badges carefully arranged on her chest. He flicked one with his finger, calling them decorations for play, not proof of real courage. He made it clear that in his mind, women like her had no place in the heart of combat. Carter did not move. Her eyes stayed forward, her posture unbroken, her silence louder than any reply. Kane's voice carried sharp in the fog, but his words seemed to slide off her like rain against armor. The tension hung in the air, cold and heavy, as if the entire base was holding its breath. The memory of Afghanistan never left her. Operation Iron Dawn was etched into Sergeant Emily Carter's mind, sharper than any scar. Her unit had been ordered to pull back when insurgents closed in on a small mountain village, the kind of order that was meant to protect soldiers rather than strangers. Over the radio, the command was clear: withdraw and leave the locals behind. Carter looked at the villagers, about 30 souls huddled in the dust, many of them children, clutching their mothers, and she knew she could not obey. She made her choice in silence, signaling a handful of soldiers who followed her without hesitation. The firefight came fast. The crack of AK rifles echoed through the valley. Dust rising with every burst of fire. The air stinging with smoke and sand. Carter crouched behind a crumbling wall, her hand tight on the radio, calling in coordinates as a JTAC would. The low growl of an A-10 Thunderbolt II rolled across the sky, its engines rattling the earth. Seconds later, its cannon thundered, sending precision fire that cut into the advancing enemy. Buying moments of breathing room, she directed the strikes again and again, her voice steady despite the chaos. Her team moved in formation, firing, pulling civilians into cover, guiding them toward an escape route. Each second was paid for in blood. By the time the last child was lifted into a transport truck, 7 American soldiers had fallen, their bodies still on the ground while the survivors pressed forward. Carter carried a young boy in her arms, his face streaked with tears, her own uniform stained with dust and blood. Relief and grief fought inside her chest as she realized they had saved lives, but at a cost that could never be forgotten. When the team returned, she filed her report with honesty. They had disobeyed but had saved 30 civilians who would otherwise be dead. The report was rewritten by higher command, reshaped into a mark of insubordination. The heroism was stripped away, leaving only the accusation that she had failed to follow orders. From that day on, the shadow of disobedience followed her, a stain in the eyes of men like Colonel Kane who saw loyalty only in blind obedience. The training ground at Fort Ashford stretched like a miniature city built for war. Wooden structures stood for houses, narrow alleys funneled movement, and mock doors led to rooms that had to be cleared one by one. The recruits wore helmets and protective vests, rifles loaded with blanks, their voices rising above the pop of simulated fire. Sergeant Emily Carter moved at the front of her squad with calm precision, her hands signaling silently, her eyes scanning for threats. She had done this countless times in real combat, and it showed. Every turn of her body, every command of her hand carried authority. The squad advanced through the maze, stacking at corners, bursting into rooms, clearing them in sequence. Carter's pace was steady, never rushed. Her words clipped but clear when she gave them. They reached the edge of the mock town, where the southwest approach opened wide. Carter crouched behind a barrier, studying the setup. It was a killing field, a bottleneck with multiple firing positions, waiting to mow them down. Even in simulation, it was suicide. She lifted her eyes to the observation tower, where Colonel Victor Kane stood, with his arms crossed, into the radio. Her voice was firm. Request permission to flank east. The reply came sharp. Denied. Proceed forward. Sergeant. Carter paused, jaw tight. She gave a brief nod, then turned to her recruits. Move as ordered. They surged into the open space, and the result was immediate. Blank rounds cracked from every angle. Recruits shouted as sensors on their gear registered hits, one after another. They went down, the mission unraveling in minutes. By the time the buzzer signaled the end, the squad was scattered. Simulated casualties piled high. From above, Kane descended with a look of grim satisfaction. He gathered the recruits, his voice loud enough to cut through the ringing in their ears. This is why we follow orders. Creativity gets soldiers killed. His words carried smug finality, aimed squarely at Carter. She stood drenched in sweat, chest rising and falling, her silence steady. She said nothing, but the injustice was plain to every recruit. Watching, the mess hall buzzed with the low hum of voices, trays clattering, and boots scraping the floor. Soldiers unwound after a punishing day of drills, their laughter brief and nervous under the weight of Fort Ashford's daily grind. The noise collapsed into silence when Colonel Victor Kane stepped through the doors. His presence was enough to stop forks midair. Every head turned. Conversations froze, and the air thickened with unease. Kane moved without hesitation, a folder in his hand, his eyes locked on Sergeant Emily Carter. He stopped at her table, flipping the folder open, his voice cutting sharp across the hall. He spoke of Operation Iron Dawn, twisting her actions into betrayal, painting her as the officer who disobeyed, abandoned her men, and stained the uniform. His tone grew louder with each sentence, meant not for Carter, but for every recruit watching. He wanted her broken in public. Carter did not flinch. She stayed seated, posture steady, eyes forward, refusing to respond. The silence from her only fueled his fury. Around them, recruits shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flicking between the two, unsure if they should look down or witness what was unfolding. The room seemed to shrink, the tension pressing like a vice. When Carter finally stood, quietly preparing to leave, Kane's temper snapped. He grabbed her by the collar, dragging her toward the restrooms. Chairs scraped as soldiers shifted, no one daring to intervene. At the back, Private Daniel Ortiz's hand slipped into his pocket. He raised his phone, the lens catching the scene as his heart pounded. He knew this could not stay hidden. He pressed record. Private Daniel Ortiz sat on his bunk that night, staring at the shaky video glowing on his phone screen. His thumb hovered for a moment before he sent it to a trusted friend, asking only that it be kept quiet. But within hours, the clip was out of his hands. It jumped from one phone to another, slipping into military group chats, Discord servers, and message boards, where soldiers traded stories about life in uniform. By dawn, it was everywhere. On Twitter, the video played on endless loops, captions stamped across it with hashtags like Courage in Uniform and Fort Ashford. On Instagram, still frames of Sergeant Emily Carter standing at rigid attention, hair dripping and uniform soaked, became instant symboles. TikTok spread it fastest of all, each repost racking up views in the millions. What people saw was not just a confrontation. They saw a female sergeant half the size of a colonel, soaked in humiliation, yet calm as she neutralized him with precision and control. Debates erupted online. Veterans praised her restraint and skill. Some voices questioned her defiance of orders. Most were struck silent by her composure, her quiet strength that cut sharper than any shouted words. The video crossed from the internet to the airwaves. News outlets ran it on repeat. Anchors reading headlines about abuse of authority at Fort Ashford. Talk shows replayed the same frozen frame, Carter's soaked figure standing tall, her voice calm and unshaken. By mid-morning, it was no longer just a moment inside a closed military base. It was a national story, carrying a weight no one could ignore. The storm had begun. The barracks were quiet, except for the faint hum of the heater and the dripping of water from Carter's sleeves onto the floor. She had not bothered changing out of her damp uniform, sitting on the edge of her bunk as if still braced for the next fight. The door creaked open and Captain Rachel Moore stepped inside, her face drawn with concern. She carried the calm authority of a medical officer, but tonight her eyes searched Carter for answers. Carter lifted her gaze, weary but steady. Moore asked why she had even requested a transfer to Fort Ashford. Knowing Kane's reputation, the question hung in the air until Carter reached under her cot and pulled out a worn folder, its edges frayed from months of use. She laid it on the bed between them. Inside were medical reports, witness statements, pages of testimony scribbled by soldiers who had long since left the base. Each page told the same story: humiliation, intimidation, abuse that had been buried or reclassified until it disappeared from the system. Carter's voice was low, her exhaustion heavy, but her conviction sharper than ever. She explained she had been gathering evidence for months, working with families of soldiers who had attempted suicide under Kane's command. At least a dozen had tried. Several had not survived. She needed to be here to confirm it firsthand, to gather proof no one could bury. Moore sat back, stunned. The viral video that had lit the internet was not part of Carter's plan. But now, Carter admitted, maybe it was the break she needed to finally force the truth into daylight. The office of General Olivia Hayes was quiet, except for the faint tick of a clock on the wall. The silence was heavy, the kind that pressed on the chest and made every breath feel deliberate. Sergeant Emily Carter stood at rigid attention in her formal uniform, her boots planted firmly on the floor, her gaze fixed forward. Captain Rachel Moore stood slightly behind her, a silent figure of support, her presence calm but steady. Across the desk, General Hayes studied the folder spread open before her. The papers were neat, but the contents were anything but medical reports, sworn statements, timelines of humiliation and abuse, a pattern of 17 suicide attempts and multiple deaths under Colonel Victor Kane's command. The evidence had been buried until Carter forced it into the light. Hayes's expression gave little away, her eyes shifting between the papers and the sergeant before her. When she spoke, her tone was even controlled, but it carried the weight of authority. Assaulting a superior officer was a grave violation. Carter acknowledged it without hesitation. She explained quietly that she broke orders because the orders were wrong, that she had never intended for the confrontation to be public. The viral video had been beyond her control. Hayes leaned back, her hands folded, the weight of her decision clear in the silence that followed. Discipline mattered. Justice mattered more. Finally, her verdict came. Kane would be suspended pending investigation. His actions too severe to ignore. Carter herself would face review for her disobedience. But the evidence she had gathered would be pushed to higher authorities. The room stayed solemn, the air thick with consequence. Yet for the first time, Carter felt the system had finally opened its eyes. The video refused to fade. By the next morning, every major network was looping the same 30 seconds of footage. Carter dripping wet, yet standing tall, her calm voice cutting through the noise. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of screens, demanding answers, calling for reform. On social media, the debate was relentless. Some saw defiance, others saw courage. But nearly everyone agreed. The moment had exposed something larger than one colonel and one base. The Department of Defense launched an official investigation within days. Carter, Captain Rachel Moore, and several families were summoned to testify before Congress. The hearings drew national attention. Families held framed photographs of their sons and daughters, voices breaking as they spoke of lives cut short. Veterans recounted the humiliation they endured, their testimonies, raw with memory. Medical experts laid out data that showed a disturbing pattern of abuse under Kane's command, linking it directly to mental health crises and suicides. Kane himself appeared, rigid and unrepentant at first. He insisted his methods built tougher soldiers. That war demanded cruelty, but when confronted with the statistics and the faces of grieving parents, his words faltered. The room shifted. Lawmakers, journalists, and the public watching from home could see the line drawn clear between discipline and cruelty. By the end of the week, Congress recommended sweeping reforms, independent oversight for training, expanded mental health protocols, and safeguards to protect whistleblowers. What began as one woman's stand had grown into a reckoning for the entire system. Arlington was quiet in the early light, the white rows of markers stretching toward the horizon. Sergeant Emily Carter walked slowly among them until she reached 7 names she knew by heart. She knelt, setting a small stone on each grave, her voice barely above a whisper, as she told them their sacrifice had not been forgotten. Because of them, change had come. General Olivia Hayes appeared beside her, her posture solemn, her words steady. Congress had approved sweeping reforms, she said. New oversight, mental health protocols, and accountability, now known as the Iron Dawn Protocol. The name itself carried the weight of Carter's choice years earlier, and the lives saved because of it. Days later, Carter stood on a small stage, receiving the soldier's medal before a crowd of families, soldiers, and recruits. The applause was respectful, quiet but sincere, and for the first time she felt seen not as a problem, but as a leader. Hayes handed her a new assignment, an instructor position at Officer Candidate School. The mission was clear: teach the next generation that integrity mattered more than fear. When Carter returned to Fort Ashford one last time, the base looked different. Near the training field, a simple plaque had been placed: integrity above rank. Recruits moved with purpose under instructors who no longer barked cruelty but demanded excellence with respect. Carter paused, reading the words, then walked away knowing the fight had been worth it.